because this morning we are continuing this series we are doing on the book of Acts, where we're going through the book of Acts that talks about how the church began at the beginning, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and all of it to find the answer to two very simple questions. What is this thing called church supposed to be like, according to God's definition, God's blueprint that you actually find in the Bible? And what do we need to change as a church individually to do better at being the church, if that's really something we want to do? If we say, I'm a Christian, I go to church, well, okay, let's do it right then, right? Let's see what God actually wants. And as we come to the last part of Acts 17 this morning, we're going to read a passage that I think is especially cool. Because as we come to Acts 17, the Apostle Paul is still on this second major mission trip where he's going all over the area where he is at that time, telling as many people as he can about Jesus and the eternal life we can have through Jesus. And in the last half of Acts chapter 17, Paul comes to a place that you may have heard of called Athens, Greece. And why I get so jazzed up about that is Athens is amazingly similar to where you and I live. Consider this. Check this out. In the city of Athens, it was a place that was basically the cultural hub back in Paul's time. It was like the number one spot for art, the number one spot for literature. It was actually the home of some of the most famous public speakers in all of history, people you still read in high school English class today, probably some of them. It was also the place that was looked to as the highest level of culture you could attain. Like everyone wanted to be like Athens was. As far as the residents of Athens go, Acts itself is going to tell us all the natives and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Sounds just like our culture, right? In fact, two specific groups you will read about here were the Stoics and the Epicureans. Now get this, the Stoics, thinking about how similar Acts is to where we live, the Stoics were all about living consistently with nature. The place I work during the week is like that. And they placed a big emphasis on the power and the authority of human relational ability. They were also big on this idea of individual self-sufficiency. Their beliefs had a lot to do with equal rights that broke down class distinctions. And they were all about their own sense of morality and duty. As one person put it, they were basically an example of pride with personal independence. And then you had the Epicureans, who, as they said, man, pleasure is the chief end of life. You know, if it feels good, do it. That's what life is all about. The pleasure most worth enjoying has to do with a life free from pain, sound like our culture, free from the fear of death, and other things they thought were just superstitious, and free from anything that could just disturb your tranquility. That's the Epicureans. Get this, as far as the political side of Athens was at this time, this particular city was very big on democracy, which is saying something because it was part of the Roman Empire, okay? Not usually a democracy when you have an empire. But as far as democracy went, the Romans gave this city special privileges, and it's still known today as the birthplace of democracy, okay? As far as the spiritual side of Athens went, it was really big on idolatry, like really big. And one commentator even said certain parts of the city looked like a forest of idols. Okay, so picture idols, a forest of idols, because there were so many, as the people there just chased all sorts of different spiritual ideas and different spirituality, right? So look at the screen there, would you agree? Sounds just a little bit like where you and I live today. You might say, yeah, but there's not forests of idols. I beg to differ. What's the definition of an idol? Anything people give their lives to, anything people pursue other than God, things they spend their time, their money, their attention, their energy on other than God, is an idol. Do we have any idols in our culture? Oh, absolutely. What do people chase? Sex, fame, success, appearance, outward appearance, power. Yeah. All kinds of things. You name it. Where we live has so many idols today. So many idols. And it's not all that different from Athens, Greece, back in Paul's time. So that tells me we should pay especially close attention to the part we're about to read, because it directly applies to you. No matter who you are, no matter what. If you live in our culture, this has something for you this morning, especially if your goal is to be the church, if your goal is to follow Christ. Let's see what it has to say for us here. Check it out. Starting in verse 16 there, Acts chapter 17, verse 16. It says this, while Paul was waiting for his traveling companions in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Look at this. So circle, underline, highlight. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. That's something we need to jot down right off the bat. But number one, first and foremost, we need to understand, Paul looked at this messed up culture around him through spiritual eyes, didn't he? In other words, he didn't get so caught up in the culture around him that he overlooked what was really going on there from a spiritual perspective as far as eternity was concerned. He looked around and realized, man, as cultured and cool as this culture may look, as it may seem, it's full of idols, and people are worshiping these things just like today, right? They're giving their lives to these things. They could be following the one true God who's actually the creator of everything, who actually has a purpose for their life that will fill them up, the God who actually sent his son to die to save them. They could know the real God and find what they're actually looking for, but man, all this idolatry, and it says that idolatry made Paul mad, right? But notice what he did with the anger. This is important for us in our culture here. Here's what he engaged the people for Jesus, right? That's the next part of the notes there. He didn't just get mad at the culture and go storming off, complaining about how messed up people are and everything's going in such a terrible direction, and go turn on his favorite program where everybody's yakking the same way, complaining about the same stuff, and he goes, yeah, I'm with you. None of that. No. He realized, dude, the problem here is these people don't know Jesus. So rather than complaining about it, I'm going to get busy trying to change that. And so he goes out, and notice he tries to reason with everyone he could. Everyone he could. From those who already believed in God to the general population outside the walls of a religious building, notice. Right? He went to where? The marketplace. Talking to anyone he could. And among those people were the guys we looked at a minute ago. Look at this, verse 18. It says, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. That'll happen in our culture too. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Now, that's a nice translation. If you read this in the Greek it was originally written down in, that word they translate as babbler is actually a slang term that people in Athens would use to mock somebody. And it was this implication that this guy has a low status and he lives by picking up scraps. Okay? Not a very nice term. All right? So, not very nice. And others, it says, remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. We've never heard of this stuff, right? They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Which, understand there, both Stoics and Epicureans would have thought the idea of resurrection was nuts. Okay, just insane. If Paul had just talked about living forever, they might have listened a little better, and everyone except the Epicureans might have even agreed with him. But they had zero place in their worldview of resurrection. Sounds like our culture, right? Want to talk about heaven? Want to talk about happy, eternal life things? Okay, start talking about specific Bible stuff. Oh, you're crazy. In fact, in their minds, there's no way, see if this sounds familiar, there's no way Paul's teaching would ever appeal to any reasonable person. Sound like our culture? Yeah, lots. But there was one place in Athens at the time that would at least hear Paul out with what he had to say, and that was a place called the Areopagus. The Areopagus was basically this thing that oversaw all the things about religion and morals in Athens. So, verse 19, check it out. They took Paul and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is you're presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we'd like to know what they mean. Here it is. All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. And they didn't even have social media, right? It's nothing new. What people do to this day on the internet is nothing new, just like Athens back then. Verse 22. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said this. Check it out. All right. He says, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Right? You guys have so many idols, you put one just in case you missed one. Just in case we missed one, this is for that God. Because so you're ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. Now, I know that might sound kind of harsh to us in English, but realize Paul's not necessarily knocking them. He's just saying, you guys even admit you may not have this all figured out. You even admit you don't know about this unknown God, but I do. So let me tell you the truth about him, and let me show you how great he is. Verse 24, Acts 17, by the way. Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man, God made all the nations. Now notice, that appeals to the guys who are very much about equality, right? No one's better than anyone else in God's sight. Ultimately, we all came from the same guy. From one man, God made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. Just a fun side note. Did you ever think that you live and go to school and work exactly where you do at exactly this time because God pre-planned that? That's what Paul's saying. You're around the neighbors, you're around the schoolmates, you're around the people you are because God specifically put you there. It's not an accident. Isn't that interesting? Come back to that. Verse 27. God did this so they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Watch this next part. Though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. See the quotation marks around those statements there? Paul's actually quoting some guys that his audience would have been very familiar with. Some kind of their superstars, right? And Paul's doing that to help him communicate the gospel to these people who've never heard it before. One of these quotes was from a poet named Epimenides the Cretan. Another is a quote from something called the Phinomeneia or something like that of Aratus. Anyway, the point is, both of those quotes, as I recall, were about Zeus when they wrote them. And Paul's not saying let's worship Zeus. And, he was considered the supreme being of this Greek and Stoic philosophy. But what Paul does, he takes what they said about Zeus and goes, no, let me tell you about the God those are actually true about. Let me redirect your attention to this real God, right? And these principles that they're actually talking about. Then he ties it all together. Verse 29. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. And he's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Okay, stop there for a second. Notice what Paul did in his attempts to reach people there, right? He tried to step into their world. He didn't sit in a church building and just expect everyone to magically come to him somehow, okay? He engaged them. He went to where they were, where they talked about ideas. As he shared Jesus, he went to where they talked about things like this, and he came to them in a way that made sense to them, that connected to them, right? A, he didn't sit in a church building waiting for people to come to him. B, when he went to talk to people, he didn't say, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? You need to study your hermeneutical exegesis and get right with it. And they're going to be like, what are you talking about? Right? The content of what Paul said is very biblical, solid, right on. But the packaging was very Greek, so that these guys could understand it. He quotes their heroes. Oh my goodness. I've never been a big fan of his music, but do you know what Kanye West released this week? Do you know what he released? His big album that's #1 on iTunes right now? What's it all about? It's all about Jesus. His entire album. He says he became a Christian, and I guess he's proving it. All 13 tracks are basically worship songs. Kanye West. And it's #1 on iTunes. Is that something we could use in our culture to connect with people? Yeah. Oh my goodness. Now, there's one song where he's complaining about how church people judge him, so that's, iffy. But even then could be a good conversation piece. But man, think about how Paul did this. He didn't alter the gospel, but he used stuff that made sense to them to present it to them, if that makes sense. Rather than expecting them to step into his world as a Christian, he stepped into their world and brought Jesus to them. Which, as part of doing that, don't miss this, he used logic and reason too. Didn't he? Right? He used a little bit of what we call apologetics, which doesn't mean you're apologizing for anything. It actually comes from a Greek word that means to defend. And it's this idea of defending what you believe with logic and reason. Right? He's going to a place where it's all about logic and reason. He didn't bring faith to a logic battle, okay? He brought logic to a logic battle with faith behind it. To argue, hey, the stuff I believe is actually solid. Like, this makes sense. It's not just, just believe because someone told me to believe stuff, so I believe it because someone told me. No, this stuff has a foundation. This makes sense scientifically, logically, philosophically. It's the only thing that makes sense because it's true, right? Apologetics is a great way to go when you're dealing with logic, reason people. Like in our culture, a lot of times, especially around here, it's very scientific. Though, of course, that doesn't mean his audience automatically accepted that. You know, I always get so excited. At the aquarium, our chief scientist is a Christian. He actually speaks around the country doing apologetics talks, but that doesn't mean everybody at the aquarium automatically accepts Christ, right? And, same back then, verse 32, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. Now, that may sound encouraging, but actually in Greek, in that culture, that was probably a polite way of saying thanks, but no thanks. You know, hey, come to church. Oh, yeah, maybe I'll check it out sometime. Yeah, you know what that really means. No, I won't. You know, oh, it's so great. You know, can I tell you about Jesus? Oh, sure. And you tell them, oh, that's so great. Yeah, you know what that means. You know, we want to hear you again, Paul. Yeah, right. No, not really. It's a nice way of saying thanks, but no thanks, like people do in our culture today. And which is probably another important thing to note there, our second note. It is difficult to reach people for Christ in a culture like ours in Athens. Okay, nothing has changed in terms of that. It is so hard to reach people for Jesus in a culture like this, even for Paul. So if it's difficult for you, don't feel bad. Don't feel like maybe I'm just not spiritual enough. Okay, Paul wrote most of the New Testament you have in your hand. All right, he was highly educated. He had a personal encounter with Jesus, even Paul struggled with people in a culture like ours. Okay, but this is huge. That doesn't mean his efforts were wasted. Look at verse 33. At that, Paul left the council. But, verse 34, some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus. Let that sink in. Wow. Also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Next note there. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. So it's not an excuse to give, no one's going to accept Christ, we should just give up. No, it's not easy, but it's not impossible. All right? Paul did still have an impact there. And even if it might not have been as big of an impact as the other places we've been reading about him going on Sundays and in our house church, man, it was still worth it. Because every single person is worth the life of Jesus to God. Every single person, even the one that drives you crazy, right? Every single person is worth Jesus' life. So if even one person accepts Christ, to God, that was worth it. Okay? And plenty more than one accepted Christ in this case. So that brings us to our big question for today as we come to our top 10. How are we doing with all this? You know, first of all, do we look at our culture like Paul looked at Athens? Do we look at it from a spiritual perspective? You know, do we look past the politics, past the fake smiles, past the filtered Instagram photos, you know, past this show that people put on? And do we see the brokenness that's behind it all? Do we see the hopelessness and the lostness that's making them do all this crazy stuff? And do we realize ultimately the problem with the world is not going to be fixed by voting someone into office or changing the internet? Man, the only thing that's going to fix it is Jesus. He is what people need. It's him that can heal their hearts and fix their hearts. And do our hearts break for lost people like God's does? Because he's not looking at our culture going, oh, well, forget them. No, he told us with Noah, I'm not going to wipe it clean anymore like that. Next time I come, there is the final judgment, but I want as many people to be saved as possible. That's why he's waiting, Peter says, right? He could have come back by now. Peter says the reason Jesus hasn't come back yet, he's giving people time to repent. He doesn't want anyone to be lost. And guess whose job it is to tell people about Jesus? Ours, right? Are we doing anything about that? You know, does it stir something up in our hearts like it did for Paul? And are we doing something about it? The fact that we have the answer they're looking for, right? If you found the cure for cancer and kept it to yourself, man, that's terrible. Don't do that. We have the cure for eternity, you know. Don't keep it to yourself. Are you engaging people in conversation, in class, in the marketplace, wherever you go? Are you trying to share Jesus, right, in a way that makes sense to them, like he commanded us to? Now, I know as soon as I say that, your first thought, that's someone, I can't do that. You know, I wouldn't be good at that. I don't know what to say. What if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to? I don't think I do very well. Time out. Don't be so sure. Check this out. A few weeks ago, there was an article about the most searched questions on, in all of Google, okay? They do these breakdowns of the most searched questions about food, you know, most searched questions about whatever. Part of what they did was a study on the most searched questions on Google about God, okay? And you know what they were? Look at these. Look at and check this out. Here are these are the questions the most people have about God that go to Google, all right? What is the Bible? What is the Bible? I've heard of the Bible. Who is Jesus? What is church? Who is God? What is a Christian? What is heaven? What is sin? What is hell? What's the gospel? What is that? What is salvation? What is prayer? What does God look like? What is the fear of God? That's it. You don't need a master's degree in theology to answer those, right? If you've been a Christian for more than a day, you know like 90% of those. Otherwise, I'm not sure how you became a Christian, okay? If you don't know what sin, Jesus, the Bible, and God are, you're probably not a Christian. Just newsflash. And the last two, if you've been paying attention or been with us the past few months on this series, you know the answer to those. We've talked about those. So don't let it scare you. Oh, I can't talk to people. What if they ask me a question I can't answer? Those are their questions. Like statistically, the majority of people, they don't know the basics. You can answer those, right? How about we practice right now?